This webinar is being organized under the auspices of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose 125th birth anniversary celebration committee. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
As you know, we formed the committee on 23rd January 2020 to mark the 125th birth anniversary of the great freedom fighter, Netaji. But as you also know, the corona pandemic threw a spanner in our work, and we could not do it as we desired and as it was originally planned. So we had to restrict ourselves to online mode mainly. Keeping in view, the committee decided to extend its activities for another year. So we are going to conclude the program on 23rd January 2023. And this webinar, as we have got point the word, the curtain raiser.
He's speaking.
3 weeks, there shall be innumerable programs throughout the country to carry the life struggle and message of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose to every nook and corner of the country. And this webinar will be addressed by two eminent personalities, and the most important speaker in today's webinar is Professor Anita Pfaff, the illustrious daughter, the indomitable Netaji. And the other speaker is Professor Soumitro Banerjee, Professor IISER, Kolkata. I will introduce those speakers to you in a few minutes. And before that, I would like to say a few lines about the programs that are to be taken during this 3-week celebration period. We have given a call, the committee has given a call, Netaji in every house. Photographs of Netaji will be garlanded throughout the country, in every house, in every nook and corner, in every crossing, in every crowded marketplaces, so that the message of Netaji is carried loud and clear to the people. When the country is passing through a very difficult phase, we think the message and life struggle of Netaji is very relevant and is becoming more and more relevant with every passing day. Now, let me introduce the guest. Our most revered guest today is Professor Pfaff, daughter of Netaji. I am reading out. Dr. Pfaff was born in Vienna in 1942. Netaji had left for Southeast Asia with his mission to lead the Azad Hind Fauj against the British, leaving his daughter when she was barely 4 months old. She has always been politically active. She is an active member of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Dr. Pfaff is a professor of economics. He had taught in the University of Augsburg, Germany. We feel honored to announce his presence in this webinar, and I feel elated. I'm electrified, elated, and honored. I feel honored because the place where I'm sitting now is just a stone's throw from the place where Netaji was born. He was born in this historic city of Kolkata, and I'm happy to announce that I was born very close to his house. Now I will introduce Dr. Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee is the president of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose 125th birth anniversary celebration committee. He was a professor of electronics, if I remember correctly, at IIT Kharagpur. Presently, he is a professor of physics at IISER, Kolkata. He has got the rare distinction of being awarded the highest scientific award, Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award, that is given to brilliant scientists below the age of 40 in our country, and that is the highest award a scientific researcher can aspire for. He is the General Secretary of Breakthrough Science Society, a society who is spearheading the movement to inculcate scientific spirit and scientific thought among the common people, particularly among the students and youth of this country. I cordially welcome both the speakers to today's webinar, and I am thankful, I'm happy to inform that thousands and thousands of people have joined today's webinar through different social media platforms, and many have joined in halls, meeting halls in different parts of the country.
Mama?
So with this introduction, I invite Dr. Pfaff to present his deliberation. Thank you.
Is there some background noise?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the warm welcome and Jai Hind to all of you. Unfortunately, my voice is not very good today. I am down with a very bad cold. So I asked my daughter, Dr. Maya Pfaff, to present my paper, which she will do, and I will just say the concluding remarks, because otherwise you will just hear a series of coughs, unfortunately. So I hand over to Maya Pfaff. Namaste. I will be lending my mother my voice, but it will be her words I will be sharing with you. She has prepared that in advance. This is the story about Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose by his daughter.
And thousands of people joined today's webinar to different
Netaji was born almost 126 years ago. He left India for the last time in 1944, when the Indian National Army had to retreat from Indian soil. And he left this world on 18th of August 1945, dying of his injuries following a plane crash in Taipei. His mission in life had always been to see his motherland become a free, sovereign country. This meant throwing off the shackles of colonial rule. It meant that Indian men and women, no longer a foreign power, would shape destiny of his India. He did not live to see his dream come true, however. India did not attain independence until 1947, 2 years after his death. And it was not one India, but India, Pakistan, and later Bangladesh that became independent states on the soil of what was once his India. He had no hand in shaping any of the new states formed in 1947, but he retained a place in the hearts of many of his countrymen and countrywomen even today. The fact that many men, women, and children still know who he was and who he is, remain grateful to him for his dedication to his country's destiny, is not self-evident. It is moreover less self-evident that even today, many men and women who have never seen him personally, who have never been exposed to the magnetism of his personality, also claim to love him and venerate him. Thereby, they repay the sacrifice he has made to his and their country. Who was this man? What were some of the major events in his life? What were his ideas and ideals? What did he envisage for his countrymen and countrywomen? Can the Indians of today, especially the young Indians of today, draw an inspiration and lessons for their own lives? Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was born on the 23rd of January, 1897 in Cuttack, as we have learned, nowadays Orissa, then part of Bengal. He was the 9th child of 14 of his parents Janakinath Bose and Prabhu Bose, nee Dutt. His mother came from a well-to-do North Kolkata family, and his father from a good but poor family in Godalia, a village south of Kolkata. Since he was a brilliant student, that was Netaji's father, he was able to become a successful lawyer who could not only provide comfortably for his large family, not forgetting his own childhood and youth, he also provided generously for other families, members, and young students from poor families, especially also from his ancestral village. His mother was a very competent manager, that is Netaji's mother, of their large household, bringing up not only her own 14 children, but also providing for some of her younger siblings, some of whom were contemporaries of Subhash. In the course of his career, he moved from Kolkata to Cuttack, where he had a comfortable home built for his growing family. This was the Bose family home when Subhash was born. The house has been renovated and made into a Netaji museum several years ago. In those days, it was not unusual in many well-to-do middle-class families that the sons were educated in English medium schools and, if possible, even sent to England for the university education. Subhash's favorite second brother, Sharat Chandra, who was given that opportunity, and he returned to become a very successful lawyer, who, however, was also engaged in the struggle for India's independence. It was he who recognized his younger brother's potential and supported him in his academic and political ambitions all his life. These two brothers remained unusually close throughout their lives, and Sharat's wife, Biswabasu too, was one of the important people in Subhash's life. For Sharat's 8 children, Subhash was a favorite uncle, more accessible, than their sometimes overpowering father, probably. And so it happened that Subhash made his second home with his brother for a long time during his political career. Subhash was at first a serious and quiet child with a brilliant mind and success in his school and academic work. But he was also a religious and social-minded youth and later adult. As a youngster, he sneaked out of the house to tend to the sick in a cholera outbreak. We can only wonder what his parents thought about this activity at the time. As a teenager, he also left his home for several months to embark on the search for a religious guru. His mother was probably not overjoyed on account of her sick son's interests. When the family returned to Kolkata, Subhash was sent to a Bengali medium school. At the time, his written Bengali was not as good as his English. When he once had to write a composition about a horse, this turned out so poor that the teacher made fun of him in front of his class. Subhash was so embarrassed that he decided to stand first in Bengali by the end of the school year. And so he did. But he did not only please his parents by performing well in school and in his academic work. As a student at Presidency College, he also challenged physically an English professor, Professor Oaten, because they felt the professor had treated the Indian students in a derogatory way. Professor Oaten was pushed down the stairs in the process. One of the consequences was Subhash's expulsion from Presidency College and rustication for life from the college. It would have also meant that he could not continue studying at any other college. Subhash's father was, however, well connected with the British leadership on account of his professional work, and he succeeded in having this ban lifted after 2 years. Subhash continued his studies at another college and made up for the time lost. He did so well in his finals that his father, upon the urging of his son Sharat, decided to send his son Subhash to England for further studies at Cambridge. He was to sit for the ICS, the Indian Civil Service exam. In those days, passing the ICS exam well enough to receive a positioning or posting in the ICS was an average Indian's idea of heaven. Well paid and associated with high status. But the ICS, even though encompassing in Indian officers, was also one major instrument of British rule over India. When Subhash passed as fourth best student, he was offered an ICS posting. But looking at the details and the spirit of what this entailed vis-à-vis his fellow Indians, he decided to decline the position. This made him the hero of other young Indians, but his parents were probably less that happy. After all, sending a son to England for his studies involved considerable expenses, and throwing away an opportunity for a successful career must have seemed frivolous to them. But Subhash had quite some time earlier decided to dedicate his life to the struggle for India's independence, not to participating in her subjugation by foreign power. He returned to India and went to see Mahatma Gandhi. However, the 24-year-old firebrand was more radical in his ideas than the middle-aged Gandhi, who had committed himself and the freedom fighters led by him to a non-violent struggle. He sent Subhash to the Bengali leader C.R. Das, who became Subhash's political father figure, and his wife, Baijanti Devi, became his second mother. At the time, Indians gained a degree of self-rule at the municipal level. C.R. Das became mayor of Kolkata and persuaded Subhash to become the executive officer of the city. All along, he was also involved in the Congress youth movement of Bengal. After Das died prematurely, Subhash felt shattered.
but he became the mayor of Kolkata at a very young age as a result. Notwithstanding this position, his activities for the independence movement did, however, lead to his imprisonment. Over the following years, Subhash's activities led repeatedly to his arrest. Between the mid-1920s and January 1941, he spent several years in prison, in home internment, or in exile abroad. Needless to say, imprisonment did not contribute to his health and well-being. When one reads the letters of my parents, or my mother's parents, my grandparents, to each other, their mutual concern about each other's health is one theme that keeps coming up. Even home internment in his brother's otherwise pleasant vacation home in Kurseong near Darjeeling was characterized by an unhealthy climate in winter. The early 1930s found him in jail in Mandalay, Burma, now Myanmar, and in deplorable health. Since his British prison masters were not keen to have him die there, he was released in 1933 on the condition that he would leave India to seek medical care abroad. This brought him to Vienna, Austria. Vienna was then a renowned center of medicine. He was diagnosed with having a severe gallbladder condition. Nowadays, a gallbladder operation is an intervention of little risk, allowing the patient to leave the hospital after about 3 days. In the 1930s, however, it involved a major incision with extended anesthesia. A patient had to be hospitalized for several weeks. Therefore, one tended to avoid such operations. Patients were sent to spas to drink the healing waters and keep to diets. Karlsbad, now in Czech Republic, was a famous spa where patients were sent to control their gallbladder problems. Subhash was not the man to succumb to his personal health problems. During the stay in Vienna, he traveled to and communicated with persons in other European countries to further the cause of his country's independence. In 1934, a British publisher gave him a contract for writing a book on India's efforts to gain independence, The Indian Struggle. Subhash was looking for a secretary to support his work, and my mother, or my grandmother, Amelia, or Mimi, as her father and friends called her, happened to be recommended to him. From the 28th of June to the 29th of November of the year 1934, they frantically worked on the book in Vienna and in Karlsbad. On 29th of November, the manuscript was almost ready to be sent to the publisher. Subhash had to leave the finishing touches to Mimi, because he had been summoned to his father's deathbed in Kolkata. In a journey by airplane, he rushed home in 4 days. That is how long it took those days. He missed his father's death by 2 days, but he received an enthusiastic welcome by the Indian public and a friendly reception by the British police, to be accompanied into home internment straight away. To his own surprise, he was allowed to leave India for Europe again in January 1935. The British rulers were happy to see him, like other Indian freedom fighters, off. Back in Europe, he had several activities on his agenda. It turned out that the spa had not been able to improve his health. His doctor urgently advised him to undergo a gallbladder operation in spring 1935. One large stone was removed. Following the severe operation, he recuperated in a rehab center and also during another stay in Karlsbad. As soon as possible, when he was sufficiently recovered, he began a busy campaign as India's unofficial ambassador at large. That the British continued to eye him as a potentially dangerous person was evident. For example, he was put under strict surveillance in Vienna when the Prince of Wales visited the city in 1935. Subhash by then was sufficiently recovered to drag his shadows of the Viennese police on a lengthy hike through the Vienna woods, at the end escaping their attention by jumping onto a tram that was just about to leave. Subhash was restless in Europe and decided to return to India in March 1936. Many things were going on in India, to which he was not willing to be just a distant observer. Even though he was informed that he would not be allowed to remain a free man upon his setting foot on Indian soil, he sailed home. As expected, the police welcomed him in Mumbai and put him up in jail right away. A few days later, he was transferred to Kolkata. He was then allowed to move to his brother Sharat's vacation home in Kurseong, near Darjeeling. While his place of detention was pleasant in summer, he was not allowed to move far from the house at all. Visitors, of course, also relatives, had to be approved by his jailers. His mail had to be censored and passed. The stay became somewhat boring, and in winter, the weather did not agree with him at all. In spring, he was moved to a Kolkata prison hospital and eventually to home internment. Excuse my mother, please. A home internment at his family home in Kolkata. He was still ailing and was therefore allowed to spend a few weeks at Dalhousie under the care of a doctor friend. During his stay in India, life was strictly controlled and supervised, but it was easier to communicate with other persons involved in the freedom struggle than from abroad. During his stay, he and my mother, or grandmother, exchanged many letters, but he was always wary of the censorship and possible confiscation of mail. The same must have applied to other mail and communication. Confidential mail had to be smuggled out by the few trusted persons who were allowed to visit. In November 1937, Subhash was allowed to travel to Europe for a short stay in his favorite spa, Bad Gastein in Austria, where he had already spent time after his gallbladder operation and prior to his return to India in 1936. He was working on his autobiography, claimed rarely had a productive period of writing. Following his stay, he was allowed to travel to England for the first time after 1921, when he had finished his studies. The Indian community in England gave him a warm and enthusiastic welcome. Subhash's return to India was momentous. He was to be elected Congress president and had a fantastic welcome as Rashtrapati, thank you, at the annual Congress at Haripura. A whirlwind time as Congress president followed. Amongst other activities, he established a planning commission chaired by Jawaharlal Nehru. Even Free India retained this institution. Let me mention just a few things about Netaji's agenda as Congress president. He and Nehru were rather young, modern leaders. They led the left wing of the Congress. Some of his major ideas and ideals for India's future were outlined in his presidential speech. From today's perspective, some ideas appear sensible. However, for those days, it was amazing how far-sighted some of his views and goals were. These ideas did not appeal at all to all the Congress leadership. The conservative right-wing followers of an exclusively non-violent leaning had no sympathy for his views on international politics, for example. The role of labor on religious tolerance, the role of women, and others. When Subhash felt that his agenda could not be completed in 1 year and tried to run for a second term in office, the right wing, and specifically Mahatma Gandhi, opposed vigorously and viciously. Nonetheless, he defeated Gandhi's candidate. By his opponents, however, his opponents were not willing to abide by democratic rules and sabotaged his work where they could. He had been very ill man during the annual Congress meeting in Tripoli, carried in on a stretcher with high fever. His presidential address had to be delivered by his brother, Sharat. He was accused of just pretending to be ill, and the Congress Working Committee resigned, unwilling to work with the president. Eventually, he resigned as president. Some Congress members continued to support him, but others kept aloof, afraid to get into Gandhi's bad books. Subhash was banned from political work in Congress, but established a group of leftist members in Congress, the so-called Forward Bloc. Subhash felt very disappointed and exhausted on account of all these developments. But on September 1st, the Second World War started in the Western theater of war by Germany's treacherous attack on neighboring Poland. This drew Britain into the war shortly thereafter. The war in the Eastern theater of war had already begun earlier with Japanese aggression towards their neighbors, especially China. With Britain and Germany, Subhash, as a British subject, could certainly not realize his intended recuperation in Bad Gastein, now also part of Germany, since the annexion of Austria by Germany in 1938 by the Nazis. These developments led to a number of changes. The Congress leadership was divided on the issue. Some advocated Indian support of Britain against fascist Germany under the condition that Britain would grant under the condition that Britain would grant India independence after the end of the war. Subhash and his faction were vigorously opposed to the idea. He did not trust the British and felt that it was preferable for India to gain the Axis power support for the struggle for independence, including military action. Britain was not willing to commit herself to Indian independence. In 1940 and thereafter, the Congress leadership as well as Subhash were jailed. Subhash realized that he would not be able to work for India's independence effectively in India. By means of a hunger strike, he was released from prison to home internment. From there, he managed to escape with the help of one of his nephews and a few other family members. In disguise, he traveled across India to Kabul, partly on foot. He tried to contact the embassy of the Soviet Union, seeking support for the Indian independence struggle. In vain. The Soviet Union only granted free passage through the country for Subhash on his way to Germany or Italy. These two countries were willing to offer support. Disguised diplomat, he traveled to Berlin, reaching in April 1941. At the beginning of his stay in Germany, the geopolitical situation seemed to suggest that Germany had something to gain by supporting India against Britain. But the attack on Germany, or of Germany on the Soviet Union in June 1941, troops in winter 1942 in Stalingrad, and also northern Africa. Germany allowed Subhash an Indian Legion, an army. They agreed that the Legion would only fight against Britain, not the Soviet Union. But it became obvious that the more important developments of World War II for India took place in the Far East. Japan had attacked the US, and the US had entered the war in support of Britain, Thereby, the two theaters of war were linked. Japan and Britain became combat enemies. The Japanese success in conquering Singapore and her willingness to support the existing Indian National Army offered better opportunities to India's struggle. For Subhash, it became necessary to reach the Far East. Under conditions of war, this was not a question of boarding a plane in Berlin and getting off in Singapore. Germany had been somewhat ambiguous in her support for India. Despite Subhash's repeated efforts to get the German government to sign an Indian declaration, committing Germany to support India's independence after the end of the war and Germany's victory, Germany was unwilling to do that. We know today that already in 1938, a secret addendum to the Hitler-Stalin Pact contained an agreement between the Soviet Union and Germany that would grant India a sphere of influence to the Soviet Union. The fascist regime of Germany had an extremely racist policy towards all non-white, especially all non-Teutonic peoples. Even though this policy was first and foremost and in the most extreme way directed against Jews, Indians were certainly also considered an inferior race. For example, mixed marriages were not welcome, if possible, forbidden. Hitler was of the opinion that India was far better off under British rule. But as long as it seemed feasible that India's struggle for independence held potential benefits for Germany, the German government was willing to support certain activities, such as a Center Free India, the Indian Legion, the support of Netaji as an ambassadorial or at an ambassadorial level, etc. No doubt, there were also a number of persons, especially in the Foreign Office, who had a high personal regard for Netaji himself. Among them, Adam von Trott zu Solz, who attempted to assassinate Hitler on 20th of July 1944 and was executed when the attempt failed. Another was the very controversial Nazi ideologue Heinrich Himmler, who for some reason had a great fascination for India and the region around India. When Netaji finally was able to meet Hitler personally, the meeting was rather disappointing. But Hitler agreed to find a way to transfer Subhash to the Far East. This was by no means easy. A plan to transport him by plane was abandoned because there was concern that it had been leaked. Eventually, it was decided to take him and one further person on February 8th, 1943, by submarine from Kiel, Germany, to the area near Madagascar in the South Indian Ocean, where he would be transferred to a Japanese submarine and on to Penang. He reached Singapore in April, where Rash Behari Bose handed over the command of the Indian League and the Indian National Army to him. Netaji gave new momentum to the struggle for independence. On 21st of October 1943, the Indian Provisional Government in exile was proclaimed in Singapore, and Japan handed over the Andaman Islands to this government. Netaji set foot on it on 31st December 1943. He was welcomed at the Southeast Asian Conference as head of state. The Indian National Army was more or less revived. Even a women's corps, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, was set up under the command of Captain Lakshmi Swaminathan. Netaji was a great believer in women's rights. For him, that meant equal rights and equal duties. The INA marched towards India, and was able to reach Indian soil near Impal and Kohima in the northeast provinces. When the monsoon came earlier than usual and the Japanese support was faltering because Japan herself was running out of resources, the INA had to give up and retreat. Netaji was offered an airlift for himself, but since the same was not possible for the women of the Rani of Jhansi soldiers, he chose to march with them. By all accounts, an exceedingly dangerous and difficult undertaking. On 6th of August, 1945, Hiroshima was bombed, and on 15th of August, the Japanese emperor addressed his people for the first time via radio to inform them that Japan had capitulated. This marked the end of the Indian struggle for the time being as well. Netaji considered alternative plans. He was offered an air passage to Tokyo in various installments for himself. He left from Bangkok to Saigon, Da Nang, and on 18th of August to Taipei, now Taiwan, then occupied by Japan. From Taipei, the plane was to take off for Tokyo. As the plane tried to take off, it crashed. Some passengers and crew died when the plane caught fire. Some, like Netaji, were badly injured. Some survived. Netaji was taken to a hospital and died because of his severe burns the same night. The interpreter who knew him from previous meetings was with him. Habibur Rahman, who had accompanied him, was too. Netaji was cremated a few days later and his remains taken to Tokyo, where they were to be kept in the Buddhist Renkoji temple for some time till they would be taken to India eventually. They still reside there today. We have to keep in mind what traumatic events took place around the 18th of August. Japan had capitulated. The US occupation forces were moved into Japan. Several investigations into the circumstances of Netaji's death were carried out, for example, by the American as well as the British and the Japanese. We can be very certain that the British government had great interest to find out what happened to their arch enemy. Were they finally rid of him, or did he escape and re-emerge once again to cause them more difficulties? Of course, these documents providing the results of the investigations were kept confidential at the time. By now, 11 reports on such investigations have become available to the interested public. The only one that differs with regard to the conclusions that he died following a plane crash was the so-called Mukherjee report. As it turns out, after accurate studying of all documents, the report surprisingly contains many mistakes. If we study the serious investigation reports, we have to accept that Netaji died on 18th of August 1945 and did not once again have a miraculous escape. Yet, we can also conclude that Netaji is not really dead. He has continued to live in the memory of his countrymen and countrywomen. Many venerate him, admire him, and even love him to this day. This is all the more surprising and gratifying since previous Indian governments have not always gone out of their way to recognize his contribution and sacrifice for India's freedom. But declassified British documents have also shown that the news of the activities of the INA, even though a failure in military terms, rekindled the enthusiasm of the Indian public in the struggle for independence. When 3 officers of the INA, a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Sikh, were court-martialed and sentenced, the Indian public and the British Indian Army and Navy did not consider them traitors, but heroes. They had to be released. The mutiny of the British Indian forces convinced the British rulers that they could no longer hold onto the jewel of the crown, India. I will let my mother say the final words to you now.
If you, especially if the young amongst you today, embrace the ideas held by the freedom fighters of those days, there are a number of ways of serving your country and working for the good. And some of the values that particularly Netaji stood for are certainly relevant today as well. The respect between the members of different religions. For example, the Indian National Army was one organization where men and women of all creeds worked together, respected each other, invited each other for their respective religious festivals, ate together. There was no Hindu and Muslim tea, but it was a joint, were joint meals and joint fighting. If we uphold other ideas that Netaji held, one important factor is also the equality of women. And unfortunately, India has, even in recent years, not always held the record of being on the forefront of women's rights. And I think if we consider that there are important human resources available to a country, Netaji saw the women and the downtrodden, sort of the lower caste and the unskilled labor, as the underutilized resource of the country. And Netaji, and by the way, also Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of Free India, were leftist leaders, as I had mentioned before. And they stood for a secular political system of their country. And for Netaji, this is no contradiction at all, even though he was a very religious man himself. Of course, being born and brought up in a Hindu family, he was a devout Hindu, but that was no reason why he could not cooperate with members of other religions on a constructive and respectful manner. Netaji had the idea of shaping India into a modern country. We don't know what might have happened if he had been involved in the politics of modern India. He certainly would have tried very hard to work for the general education of all men and women. I don't know whether he would have succeeded in eradicating illiteracy. He certainly would have worked for the good health of all. And if we look at today's situation, of course, we have to realize that many of these problems are far more difficult to address than one might have envisaged at the time. But we can also see that there is enough scope left for work for Indians today, for their country and for their countrymen. And I think if we realize that the motto should not be, what can my country do for me, as Kennedy put it at one time, but what can I do for my country? I think there is ample of scope for particularly the young Indians to work for India, apart from also working for their own life. We cannot expect that all the young Indians today sacrifice so much for their country, leaving alone career and family and everything. But we certainly can find a different kind of work-life balance, which involves work, family, and work for the country and the public at large. There is enough work to be done, and there's enough scope throughout the world that we can work for the improvement of the situation. So I think if you want to keep Netaji alive, this is what you can do. And I wish you well for this effort. Jai Hind to all of you.
Thank you, Professor Anita Bose Pfaff. It's a lifetime experience to see Netaji's daughter and granddaughter in the same frame and listening from both of them. It's a lifetime experience. I'm profusely thankful to Professor Anita Bose Pfaff for scripting her speech, and delivering the concluding address. Now I request Professor Soumitro Banerjee, our second speaker of today's webinar, to put his views on Netaji, his life struggle, and what the present generation of youth and students have to learn from his life struggle. Professor Banerjee.
Now we are going through the 126th year of the birth of the great man, Netaji, and the nation is celebrating the 126th year. But I feel that commemoration of the life and struggle of such a great man becomes meaningless, fruitless, unless we intend to learn from it. Unless the youth of today identifies the things to be learned from the great man and practices that in their lives. So what I should, I think, concentrate on is what I think we should learn from the life struggle of Netaji. The details of his life has already been covered by Dr. Anita Bose Pfaff, and so I need not go through the whole details of his life. So I'll rather focus on the salient issues which I feel are important to take lessons from. Firstly, as you know, in the Indian freedom struggle, there were two major trends. One was the compromising trend, and the other was the uncompromising trend. The compromising trend championed by Gandhi and his followers, while the uncompromising trend comprised the act of the revolutionaries like Khudiram, like Binay Badal Dinesh, like Asfakullah Khan, and many others. Now, Netaji actually belonged to the uncompromising trend of the Indian freedom struggle. But it stands out in one way from the rest of the people who engaged in uncompromising struggle. That is, when he came back from England, rejecting the offer of the ICS, then he flung himself into the Indian freedom struggle. And at that time, he found that in order to really gain independence, it has to be an uncompromising struggle, but that uncompromising struggle had to involve the people. It has to be a mass movement. And at that time, Congress was the platform for the mass movement. Mass was involved with the Congress. So he decided to join the Congress and then steer it into the path of an uncompromising struggle. That was his attitude. And that is why when he came back from Europe, as Dr. Anita Pfaff has outlined the story of how it happened, he came back and he was elected the president of the Congress. He was already a very well-known man, well-known leader, and his charisma, his leadership was accepted by the people, so he became the president. In the presidential speech itself, he outlined his plan, how he plans to steer the Congress. Now, it is worth noting. One thing is that he is giving a call for a mass movement. That was his political line. A political line where militant mass movement is the means. So if we want to learn from it, for today's generation, true, our problems are different. True, we live in a different world, but we also have problems. And if you have to learn something from the acts of Netaji, we learn that the right way of solving the problems in people's lives is to launch militant mass movement involving the masses. This is the line, political line, but there's also a matter of strategy. In any political struggle, there is a question of political line, there's also a question of strategy. When he was in Europe, it was the time when fascism was raising its head in Germany and in Italy, and the war preparation was afoot. Everybody in Europe knew that a war is in the offing. And he realized that this is the opportune moment to launch the ultimate struggle to free India. Why? This is what he said in his presidential speech of 1938. He said, let me read, "We should take advantage of the World War and strike at the British imperialism during this war. If we fight in other times, the British imperialism would deploy the full might of their military power, but now they are preoccupied with war in many fronts. So they will be unable to deploy the full military power against the freedom movement. It is easiest to defeat the enemy by striking at the moment when it is the weakest." There's something to be learned from there. Today's time, we also have to launch movements. We also have to identify the enemy and we have to fight the enemy. And we learn from his approach, we should strike the enemy when it is the weakest. Weakest due to its own internal contradictions within the imperialist camp. Not only that, many freedom fighters of that time only thought of making India free, and little did they think regarding the kind of India that should take shape post-independence. What kind of society do you want to build? Netaji had a very clear idea regarding that. And that he clearly spelled out in that presidential speech, 1938. He said, "The first objective of the Congress is to earn full freedom, Purna Swaraj. The next objective is establishment of socialism. The workers and peasants have to be drawn into the freedom movement. Landlordism is to be abolished." Clear idea. And it is true that when he was in Europe, he was exposed to the developments in European countries, and he knew that the Soviet Union came out of the clutches of Tsarist rule only in 1917. And in 20 years' time, that country had become from a rural, agrarian, impoverished country into one of the industrially advanced countries in 20 years. At that time, the per capita income of the Soviet individuals was rising at the highest rate all over the world. So he was influenced by the concept of socialism, and he wanted India to be socialist. That's another lesson that we learn from his struggle. But as we know, that this did not go down well with the established leadership of the Congress. They conspired. We have heard already regarding that conspiracy. They conspired and forced Netaji to resign from the Congress. He basically was thrown out of the Congress. They made it impossible for the president of the organization to work within the organization. Thus, he was forced to resign. Now, when this turmoil was going on, what was his reading? Why this turmoil? Why was he thrown out of the Congress, the president of the organization thrown out of the organization? Why? He says in Crossroads, their apprehension was that once a nationwide movement takes off, they would lose the leadership and control over the national movement. Their aim was to bypass struggle in every way to hold on to whatever power had reached their hands, and to negotiate for more power in closed-door meetings. So that was their objective, the objective of the Congress leadership. But he had one more very important thing to say. Why didn't the Congress choose the path of a mass movement? As he said, that it was going in the, it had a possibility of losing the grip over the movement. But to whom? There lies the point. It was a time when the Indian capitalist class had also become reasonably strong. They wanted to free the country in order to get the complete control over the market. They wanted the British to go to get a complete control over the market, to be only exploiters of it. But Netaji wanted a socialist plan. So their interest and Netaji's interest were at odds. Netaji realized that. So he wrote, in reality, what lay behind our party struggle was class struggle. So the defeat of Netaji in the Congress arena was actually, for that time, such situation. What would you expect? We would expect that those who are considered to be leftist should stand by them, stand by Netaji. As I said, at that time, the Congress was not a party. It was a platform of all faiths, beliefs, all activities, all parties for the Indian freedom struggle. So it was a platform, it was not a party. So different parties, political parties, were part of the Congress. So the Socialist Party, the Congress Socialist Party, was a part of the Congress. They supported the Congress leadership and helped them in defeating Netaji. Did the Communist Party of India support him? No, they did not. They abstained from voting, thus helping the ruling clique of the Congress to defeat Netaji. So Netaji was very disillusioned about this, but he never became disillusioned about the communist ideals. So he once wrote in spite of the universal and humanist appeal of communism, in India, communism could not advance very far. It is because the method and tactics of the protagonists of communism in India adopted alienated the people instead of making them friends and supporters. So this is what we have to understand, that the parties which are now visible in India, ruling in India, in center and in different states, what role did they play when Netaji was launching his struggle? And we find that right now they are also garlanding the images and statues of Netaji. We have to take that in the right spirit. When Netaji needed their support, did they? They didn't. Now we know that in 1941, he escaped from India, went to Germany, sought German help, but he was never harbored any illusion regarding the ideals of the fascism. He never supported the ideals of fascism. Basically, when he went out of India, he sought the help of Soviet Union in launching the struggle, armed struggle. Why did he go out? Why did he have to go out? Because after resigning from the Congress in 1939, he ran from pillar to post. Trying to build a left movement in the country to unite, but that failed. They did not give him a helping hand. So he realized, and he was interned, he was jailed. So he realized that it is practically impossible to do that from within India. But it was the time when the war was raging. It was the time when the British was in, that was the time to strike. He was trying to get all the like-minded forces unite movement when the Congress didn't. In that also he failed. We need to understand these issues. And then he went out. He went to Germany, and then, as you have already heard, he took a very appealed to the Germans, to the prisoners of war. Who were already in German jails, they are in Germany. But he found it impossible to mobilize that army, move that army from Germany into Indian land. It was impossible to move such an army over the landmass. So he had to go to Southeast Asia and join the Japanese to launch the war. But how was this taken by the Indian political establishment? How was this taken? His attempt, when the attempt to launch a movement in India failed, he attempted to wage the war from outside using Indians. How was this taken? Well, branding Netaji as agent of fascism and naming him as Quisling. Quisling was a Swedish general who sided with the fascists. Naming him as Quisling, Jawaharlal Nehru said, if Subhash comes to the country, I shall greet him with an open sword. Not only that, the so-called communists also said, we shall greet Subhash Chandra with a garland of bullets. So he did not get support within India when he was launching his battle outside India. As you know, he went to the Southeast Asia and for the first time built an army of Indians. and launched a battle. His idea was that once he is able to breach the British defenses and somehow penetrate the Indian land, there would be an upheaval in the country. The youth of the country will rise up, will revolt. So the effect of an Indian army defeating the British, reaching Indian soil is enormous. That is what his plan was. And that is why he gave the call, Chalo Delhi. But in a war, only gallantry doesn't suffice. You also need equipment. You also need arms, ammunition, heavy arms, heavy artillery. You also need transportation. You also need communication equipment. And it is this in which he lacked. And the Japanese did not give him the amount of support that was really needed for a successful war. War is the machinery that needs various things, most important logistic support. And he did not do that. Still, he succeeded in penetrating the British defense and entering Indian soil. But as Anita has already said, it was a rainy season. Rain had come early, and the logistics were failing. There was a situation that the advancing force that entered today's Manipur, that would be encircled and annihilated. So he had to order that army to come back. So the situation did not permit the kind of plan he had for India. But we need to understand that what we need to learn from this, what we need to learn from these, what we need to learn from the struggle that Netaji launched is that we have to adopt all possible means to obtain victory against the enemy. And the victory should be aimed at welfare of the people. In this case, in his case, it was emancipation of India, establishment of a socialist India. That is what he attempted, but unfortunately, the circumstances did not permit him to reach the goal before he died. It was only a 48-year life. Can you imagine? So eventful. Every move he made with a very clear vision, very clear idea, what is trying to achieve, what should be the means to achieve that. And this is what we need to learn. In India, we have a large number of problems. We need to solve it. And in order to solve it, even though the situation has changed, his life, his actions, his thoughts show us the way. I said that the socialists, the communists did not help him when he needed that support the most. The reason was that the Congress did not want to support him because Congress decided to help the British during the war. And surprisingly, the Communist Party of that time, CPI, also decided to help the British during that time. Why? They had a peculiar argument that since therefore the British are the friends of the Soviet Union, therefore our friends also. Now, after the whole war was over, India that visited the Soviet Union, and the delegation met Stalin, and they reported in flowery language how they supported, helped the war effort of Soviet Union by supporting the British. Now, Stalin said to Dr. Ranen Sen, perhaps, he says, perhaps you know that Britain and United States rendered us practically no help. We have won on the basis of our own strength. At first, they didn't even want to open a second front. When the Red Army started advancing in pursuit of Hitler's army, they became afraid that the Red Army would overrun the whole of Europe, and from that fear only, they opened a second front. And then, a visibly annoyed Stalin commented, by giving up opposition to imperialism, you have in a way collaborated with the British. So what I'm trying to point out is that the Communist Party of India, what they did is not the position of communism. They deviated from the position of communism. Now, India today is beset with many problems. One important problem is communalism. The problem of communalism was there when Netaji was alive. In no mean measure, it was there. What was his take on that? He writes regarding religion and politics. He writes, politics should be from religion. Religion ought to be a matter of personal belief. He should have full freedom to follow the religion of his choice. Politics should not be guided by religion or ideas of the supernatural. It should be guided solely by economic and political deliberations. Notice, he himself was a devout Hindu. But when it came to the state policy, he is very clear about it. Politics has no role to play. Religion has no role to play in politics. Now, he stood by that in all possible ways. There is a story narrated by one soldier of the INA, Indian National Army, that a few soldiers of the Indian National Army, when it was fighting the British in Southeast Asia, composed a song that combines all religions, talks about unity of all religions. And they presented that song before Netaji, thinking that Netaji will be glad of the unity of religions. Netaji was not glad at all. He said, listen, I want to make one point very clear to you. I shall never allow religion to be admixed with our activities. Nationalism should be our only basis. You want to unite them in the name of religion. If this happens, then one day they will be divided again in the name of religion. There are gurudwaras, mosques, temples. They may go anywhere according to their choice. But in my world, there is no place for anything that is devoid of nationalism. Clear. And at that time, when he was operating in India, the communal forces were also operating. The Hindu Mahasabha was there. The Muslim League was there. And regarding their activities, Netaji wrote, the Hindu Mahasabha sends sannyasis and sannyasins with trishul in their hands to beg for votes. Hindus unhesitatingly bow down on seeing trishul and the saffron. Hindu Mahasabha has thus appeared on the political scene by using religion and thus contaminating it in the process. Every Hindu should condemn this. We want that all freedom-loving men and women of the country served the country unitedly and intently. That was his take on those, even though he was a devout Hindu himself, this is his take on those who use religion in politics. He says, we hear voices of Hindu Raj in India owing to the majority of the Hindu population. Since Hindus are majority in India, there is a bogey of Hindu state. These are all useless thoughts. There can be no, notice this, there can be no bigger lie than saying that the interests of the Hindus and the Muslims are different. Hunger, unemployment, illiteracy, these are the basic questions. So he is doggedly against any form of communalism. But communalism was there. It's ground reality. In people's psychology, communalism was there. How to eradicate that? He also thought on that issue. And since today I am focusing on what we should learn from his thoughts, we should focus on this. He says, in the situation today, he's talking about that situation, you will find that as perfectly applicable today. In the situation today, it may seem impossible to uproot the cancer of communalism. But the task will become much easier if we can develop revolutionary mentality covering the entire nation. In the freedom struggle, when the people become comrade in arms of one another, their life will be kindled with a new inspiration for one common goal. And together with this, we'll develop a new approach, a new vista will open up, and a new vision will unfold. When this revolution happens, the Indian people will be transformed to a new type of people. So he envisioned uniting people by the force of mass movements, by involving them in mass movements, so that they fight together, fight together for a common goal. And today also, that is the only remedy for the cancer of communalism. Now, today we see communalism as a cancer, but also we see it being propagated actively by political forces. Unfortunately, that's also true. These political forces existed then also. What was their role? RSS existed then. And let me quote from their point of view. Golwalkar, in his writing, says, the theories of territorial nationalism and of common danger, which formed the basis of our concept of a nation, had deprived us of the positive and inspiring content of our real Hindu nation, and made many of the freedom movements, within inverted commas, freedom movements, virtually anti-British movements. Anti-Britishism was equated with patriotism and nationalism. This reactionary view, according to him, has had disastrous effect on the entire course of freedom struggle. So he thinks that the movement should not be directed against the British. British should be treated as an ally. And echoing him, when the war started, Savarkar gave a call to all Hindus to enlist in the British army. To enlist in the British army. Therefore, what I'm trying to show is that the political forces that you see in India today, of various shades and colors, they all opposed Netaji when Netaji was operating. All without exception. And yet, today you see them garlanding the statues of Netaji. The youth of the country need to be aware of this. The youth of the country need to be aware or need to condemn placing on the same pedestal Netaji and those who oppose Netaji. Today, many of our people do not know the history, do not know the political differences, do not know the ideological differences. And that is why two people making stand side by side, both projected as great, we have to understand, no, there were differences. And we have to identify which is the correct path, which is not. And Netaji said one important thing. Netaji said that one cannot build a character without a great ideology. In order to build a character, in order to be a real man, you have to have the correct ideology and doggedly pursue it. So getting the correct ideology, identifying the correct ideology is a very important thing. Netaji told us. Yet, people of different ideologies are projecting as our gurus. No, we have to identify who is what. But we have to see one important thing. Why and how did a character like great character Netaji build? We also want to be great, right? We also want to play important roles in the country today, in the concrete situation that is pertaining today. We also want to follow his footsteps, but how? Netaji says an important thing. He says, you perhaps think that great men are born great. They do not become great through practice, labor, toil, diligence. This idea is totally wrong. If you carefully go through the life history of all the great men who appeared on earth, you will see that there is a limitless perseverance, untiring effort, single-minded dedication, and ceaseless toil. If you really try with dedication and effort, you will also reach a position of greatness. So, the way to reach a position of greatness is to have the correct ideology, to follow that correct ideology with great diligence, great perseverance, and ceaseless toil. And one important thing, if you do not have that, we cannot follow Netaji. That is the love for the people. Love for the nation is an amorphous concept. Nation, India. But the people of the country, they are sharing a common history. They share a common culture. They share common problems, and their remedies are also the same. That people, the downtrodden people, Netaji had unflinching love for them. In fact, in one of his writings, Nutanen Sandhane, he says, a small incident at an opportune moment may leave a deep impression on our life. In Calcutta, a decrepit old lady used to sit every day in front of our house and do begging. Whenever I used to go out or come in, I could not help looking at her. Whenever I looked at her, or even thought of her sad face and tattered clothes, that used to torment me. Next to her, I considered myself to be so happy and affluent that I felt a sense of guilt. Such thoughts made me revolt against the existing social system. And he says, every man is a product of a process. What process should we follow if we want to follow the footsteps of Netaji? He also clearly lays that out. He says, that whenever you notice any atrocity, injustice, or exploitation, protest boldly, with head held high, and try utmost to resist it. If in my small life I have gained any strength, it is earned only in this way. So I would request the younger generation to consider the way Netaji built himself. We can also build himself in the same way. But man is a product of a process. You have to follow that process, love for the people, and a particular process of protesting whenever you see any injustice, any wrong being done. Before I end, I will just touch upon one issue. Netaji has himself written that in the early part of his life, he was influenced by the Hindu ideal of celibacy. He was, that is, brahmachari. But when he was in Europe, when love came into his life, he had no hesitation in accepting that. And I would honor this lady, Emilia Schenkel, with all my heart, because to be respected by a man like Netaji requires a great character. Without a great character, to earn the love and respect of Netaji is not possible. And Emilia Schenkel has demonstrated with her life she had that character. As you know, soon after Anita was born, Netaji left in a submarine for fighting the British in Southeast Asia and never returned. Yet, Emilia Schenkel never had any reproach on that. He never harbored any grievance that Netaji did not look after the family. Not only that, there was a proposal that some of the she be supported financially with some of the INA funds. She politely refused. After the independence, Jawaharlal Nehru also proposed that she be supported with by government of India. She politely refused, and she went through great economic hardship, but she never compromised on these issues. So, from this platform, I would like to say that we have our deepest respect for Emilia Schenkel. So with that, I would like to end my discussion. My only appeal to the younger generation today is that you find when 23rd January approaches, all political forces will start eulogizing Netaji, garlanding his statues, and speeches after speeches. It is from the core of our heart, if we respect that man, then we should try to follow him. These political forces are trying to use Netaji today for electoral gains and nothing more. We should be aware of that. Netaji is not a person to be subject of electoral gains. And we have to learn from him. And we have to take him in deep respect. Finally, we have a lot of problems in India today. And if we follow the footsteps of Netaji, then we have to seek its remedy to militant mass movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee. Thank you for your illumining speech. We heard from Professor Anita Bose Pfaff the life sketch of Netaji and what she expects from the present generation of Indians to do. And from you, we have heard a very critical analysis of Netaji's life struggle from the platform of Congress, the then international situation, particularly centering around the Second World War, Netaji's role in it, Netaji's attempt to win Indian independence by the force, by armed forces, and the limitation, why that attempt failed. We have also given a call to the youth and students of this country. Now we see Netaji, political parties, political forces highly inimical to Netaji when Netaji operated and tried to streamline, to strengthen the Indian fight against freedom, against the British rule. They opposed Netaji in all the ways, all possible ways. For those very forces, they are trying to appropriate Netaji, to absorb Netaji. The ruling class has failed, the ruling people have failed to erase the memory of Netaji from the heart of the people, common people of the country. So they have come up with another strategy to appropriate Netaji, so that the real Netaji can be kept hidden from the public gaze. So I think Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose 125th birth anniversary celebration committee in national and state level, in local level, will unravel, will unmask this attempt of the ruling clique, be it the present ruling dispensation, be it the people who ruled country after independence. All of them have tried either to erase Netaji from the public mind or to malign Netaji. The present attempt is to appropriate Netaji, to unmask those people. I hope students and youth of this country will carry the message, correct message of Netaji as elaborated, as enunciated, as discussed by Professor Soumitro Banerjee, and make this centenary celebration, 126th birth anniversary celebration. I won't tell it a celebration. It's rather, it's an pledge, and the committee has come out with a pledge. Students and youth of this country in thousands and thousands will take the pledge to fulfill the unfulfilled task of Netaji. With these words, and with my sincere gratitude and thanks to Professor Anita Bose Pfaff, his daughter who helped her, and Professor Banerjee, I declare this webinar closed. Thank you all. Hope this 3-week-long program will be highly successful throughout the country. Thank you.
Praveen?
Streaming has ended, no?